You look around the room, and the realization lands with a quiet, undeniable weight. You are the oldest person here. The faces in the chapel are smoother, their steps quicker, their conversations filled with names and references to a world that feels increasingly unfamiliar. The hymns are sometimes sung at a tempo that leaves you slightly behind, and the announcements from the pulpit concern activities and programs designed for families who are in the thick of the struggle you left behind decades ago. In those moments, sitting on the padded bench of a suburban meeting house or a quiet rural branch, a subtle but persistent thought can creep in. You might begin to feel like a relic, a quiet, respected, but ultimately bypassed piece of the scenery. You wonder if your presence is merely a habit, a lingering echo of a past era, or if there is still a purpose for you in a church that seems so intensely focused on the future and the young. This is not a superficial discomfort. It is a deep, existential loneliness that often visits the latter half of a long discipleship. You watch young parents wrestling with toddlers in the pews, and instead of feeling a warm nostalgia, you might feel a sharp, sudden pang of exhaustion on their behalf, or perhaps a quiet grief for the way your own children grew up and walked paths you did not choose for them. You hear young missionaries speak with an easy, untried boldness about things you have spent 50 years weeping over, bleeding for, and slowly learning to surrender to God. You see the leadership of the ward pass into the hands of men and women who were in primary when you were already serving in bishoprics or relief society presidencies. The temptation to quietly slip into the background, to treat your church attendance as a passive habit rather than an active ministry, is incredibly strong. You may feel that your work is done, your testimony is recorded, and your remaining years are simply a waiting room for the next life. But this perspective, though understandable, misses the profound, eternal design of the restoration. When Joseph Smith was laying the foundations of this dispensation, he did not envision a church where the old simply made way for the young, or where the aged were meant to sit quietly as retired spectators while the youth ran the kingdom. He understood a truth that is deeply woven into the ancient patriarchal order of the priesthood, that age is not a biological decline to be managed, but a sacred, covenantal office to be inhabited. The restoration asks something specific of the oldest generation in the room, something that cannot be outsourced to curriculum, technology, or youthful enthusiasm. It asks for your living presence. It demands the weight of your lived memory. It requires you to be the physical embodiment of the covenant for those who have only ever read about it on screens or in manuals. To understand this responsibility, we must look to the very structure of the early church in Nauvoo, Illinois, during the final, intense years of Joseph Smith's ministry. In the early 1840s, as the prophet was racing against time to bestow the keys of the priesthood upon the 12 apostles and to introduce the full temple ordinances, he spent an extraordinary amount of time instructing the older members of the church. He did not treat them as an administrative burden or a group to be placated with social gatherings. Instead, he organized them. He sought their counsel. He established the Patriarchal Association and restored the ancient understanding of the patriarchal order, not merely as an office for giving blessings, but as a living chain of covenantal authority that linked the generations together in a physical, tangible way. Joseph Smith understood that a community without its elders is a community without an anchor. In those raw, mud-slick streets of Nauvoo, where malaria took the young and persecution threatened the survival of every home, the physical presence of men and women who had survived the expulsions from Ohio and Missouri was a theological necessity. When the young grew terrified of the gathering storm, they did not merely look to Joseph's revelations. They looked at the faces of the older saints who had walked out of far west, who had buried children along the frozen roads, and who were still standing, still praying, still building. The prophet taught the 12 apostles that the testimony of the older generation was a unique and essential shield for the faith of the younger. He knew that while the young could carry the physical burdens of building temples and clearing forests, only those with decades of accumulated experience could carry the weight of a mature, unshakable witness. This was not a passive honor. It was a grueling, daily ministry of remembrance. In the early days of the Restoration, older members were expected to stand in public meetings and relate what they had seen, heard, and felt. They were the living archives of the kingdom. Joseph Smith recognized that the written word, as sacred as it is always cold compared to the warm breath of a living witness. When an older saint stood up and said, I was there when the light descended in the Kirtland Temple. Or, I heard the voice of the prophet at the stand in Nauvoo. The younger generation was not just learning history, they were being grafted into a living tree. The old were the bridge across the chasm of time, ensuring that the fire of the original experience did not fade into mere ink and paper. This historical pattern reveals a profound doctrinal truth: the doctrine of the living testimony. There is a vast, eternal difference between information and embodiment. In our modern world, information is cheap, abundant, and instantaneous. A young person in your ward can access every revelation, every historical document, and every general conference address ever given with a few taps of their finger. They can read about the pioneers. They can study the lives of the early prophets. They can analyze the Greek and Hebrew roots of our scriptures. But what they cannot do is find the weight of 60 years of kept covenants on a screen. They cannot download the quiet, steadying peace that only comes from having survived a lifetime of disappointment without losing your faith. You see, the younger generations are often rich in zeal but desperately poor in perspective. They live in a cultural moment that is intensely hyperreactive, where every small crisis feels like the end of the world, and every personal trial feels like an unprecedented tragedy. They are surrounded by a world that tells them that if something is not easy, it is not true, that if a relationship or a community is imperfect, it should be abandoned. When they look at the church, they often see only the immediate struggles, the administrative adjustments, the social pressures, the historical questions they do not know how to resolve. They are easily shaken because their roots are still close to the surface. This is where your presence becomes an act of priesthood power. When you sit in the chapel week after week, with your gray hair, your lined face, and your slow, deliberate movements, you are a physical monument to endurance. You are telling every young person in that room, without saying a word, that the covenant is strong enough to hold a human life from youth to old age. Your presence says, I have seen the seasons change. I have seen leaders come and go. I have buried those I loved. I have made mistakes and had to find my way back to the altar through painful repentance. I have had prayers that seemed to go unanswered for decades. And yet, here I am. The Lord is still good, the covenant is still true, and the bread and water of the sacrament are still the most important things in my week. This is a witness that no young, energetic speaker can ever provide. A young person can preach with fire, but they cannot preach with the authority of 30,000 mornings of prayer. They cannot speak with the dignity of someone who has watched their own body slowly fail, yet whose spirit continues to expand in light and charity. The Restoration does not ask you to have the answers to every modern intellectual objection, nor does it ask you to adopt the language and style of the current culture. It asks you to embody the long-term reality of redemption. It asks you to show the youth what a human being looks like after 50 years of being chiseled, polished, and refined by the hand of Jesus Christ. To live this ministry, you must first reject the worldly lie of spiritual retirement. Our broader culture has constructed an image of aging that is thoroughly self-indulgent and spiritually vacant. It tells you that the goal of your later years is to withdraw from responsibility, to amuse yourself with leisure, to preserve your remaining comfort at all costs, and to leave the heavy lifting of society and faith to the next generation. It treats the old as a demographic to be entertained or a problem to be solved, rather than a sacred counsel to be revered. If you accept this worldly script, you will find yourself growing increasingly detached from your congregation, viewing your ward not as your flock, but as a weekly chore that you attend out of duty. But the covenant path has no retirement phase. The temple covenants you made did not include an expiration date or a clause that released you from service once you reached a certain age. Indeed, the ancient pattern is that the most critical spiritual work of a person's life often occurs in their final decades. Think of Lehi, old and dying in the wilderness of the New World, gathering his sons around his bed to deliver his final, towering discourse on agency, the fall, and the redemption of Christ. Think of Alma the elder, who in his old age established the church in the land of Zarahemla and set its affairs in order before departing. Think of Joseph Smith's own father, Patriarch Joseph Smith Sr., who on his deathbed in Nauvoo gathered his children one by one, laid his hands upon their heads, and sealed his final, tearful blessings upon them, leaving a legacy of faith that sustained his family through the martyrdom and the trek west. These men did not spend their final years resting on their past achievements. They did not say, "I have done my part. Let the young handle the rest." They understood that the closer they drew to the veil, the more urgent their voice became. They knew that their final words, spoken from the edge of mortality, would carry a weight that no youthful sermon could match. Your later years are not a postscript to your life of faith. They are the climax. They are the season where your testimony is meant to be at its most concentrated, its most distilled, and its most generous. This means you must see your local ward or branch not merely as a place where you receive ministering, but as your primary field of labor. You are not there as a remnant of a bygone era. You are there as a sentinel. When you walk into that chapel, you should look at the congregation with the eyes of a spiritual mother or father. You should look past the superficial differences in dress, music, and program administration, and see the real, quiet, desperate needs of the young souls around you. You should see the young mother who is drowning in exhaustion and doubt, wondering if she is failing her children. You should see the young man who is struggling with secret addictions, terrified that he has sinned away his place in the kingdom. You should see the young couple whose marriage is fraying under financial and emotional stress. They do not need you to judge them. They do not need you to complain about how much better things were in your youth, or how the standards of behavior have slipped, or how the ward activities are not what they used to be. That is the voice of a spectator, not a witness. What they need from you is a steady, non-judgmental presence that whispers, "I know this road. I have been where you are. I have felt that panic, that shame, and that exhaustion. And I promise you, by the power of my own witness, that God will not abandon you. You will survive this." Imagine the power of an older sister who walks up to a young mother struggling with a noisy child in the hallway, not to offer unsolicited parenting advice, and certainly not to give a cold, disapproving look, but to look her in the eyes with absolute warmth and say, "You are doing a beautiful work. I sat in this very hallway 40 years ago feeling just as overwhelmed as you do today. It is worth it. You are enough." Imagine the power of an older brother who pulls a struggling young return missionary aside, not to lecture him about his grooming or his attendance, but to say, "I made many mistakes when I was your age, and I spent years wondering if the Lord could still use me, but His mercy is wider than you can possibly imagine. Do not give up on Him." This is the ministry of presence. It is a work that requires no formal calling, no administrative budget, and no physical stamina beyond the ability to show up, to look, to listen, and to love. It is a work of active spiritual investment. When you sit in Sunday school or Relief Society or Elders Quorum, your role is not to dominate the discussion with long, nostalgic stories of how things were done 40 years ago, but to offer the quiet, stabilizing weight of perspective when the conversation begins to drift into speculation or anxiety. Your voice should be the one that gently pulls the focus back to the simple, enduring truths, the reality of the atonement of Jesus Christ, the necessity of personal revelation, and the safety of the covenant path. This responsibility is especially critical when it comes to the complex, painful realities of family life and the choices of the younger generation. Many of you are carrying a deep, quiet sorrow that you rarely speak of in public. You have children or grandchildren who have walked away from the covenant. You raised them in the church, you held family home evening, you prayed over their beds, and yet they have chosen paths that have led them far from the temple. You may carry a heavy burden of self-reproach, constantly replaying the past, wondering if a different word, a gentler approach, or a stronger example might have saved them. You look at the young families in your ward who seem so perfect, and you feel a quiet, aching sense of failure. If this is your burden, the restoration speaks to you with profound comfort and a clear, urgent charge. The history of the restoration is not a story of perfect, unbroken family lines. It is a story of complicated, messy, and often painful family dynamics. Think of Joseph Smith's own family. His brother William was a man of volatile temper who openly rebelled against Joseph's leadership at times, causing the prophet immense emotional distress. Yet Joseph never stopped loving him, never stopped praying for him, and never closed the door of fellowship to him. Think of the great scriptural patriarchs. Think of Lehi, who wept and pleaded over Laman and Lemuel until his final breath. Lehi was a prophet of God, a man of immense faith, yet his righteousness did not override the agency of his eldest sons. The doctrine of the restoration does not promise that our faithfulness will guarantee the choices of our children, but it does promise that our covenants have a long-reaching arm. Elder Orson F. Whitney, in a famous and comforting promise that has been echoed by many prophets since, taught that the sealings we make in the temple are not passive ceremonies, but active spiritual forces that exert a powerful, redemptive pull on those who have wandered. He taught that the tent pegs of the covenant are driven deep, and that the influence of faithful parents and grandparents will eventually make itself felt, even if it is not fully realized until the next life. Your responsibility to your wandering descendants is not to save them through your own anxiety or to lecture them into submission. Your responsibility is to remain standing. You must be the fixed point, the North Star, the anchor that does not move, no matter how violently the cultural winds blow them around. If you grow discouraged, if you throw up your hands and allow your own faith to grow cold out of grief or frustration, you are cutting the very line that connects them to the covenant. But if you stand firm, if you continue to love them without compromise while refusing to compromise your own standards, you are maintaining the spiritual highway that will make their return possible. You are the ancestor they will look back to when their own lives fall apart. Right now, your grandchildren or great-grandchildren may seem entirely indifferent to your faith. They may roll their eyes at your testimonies or ignore your gentle invitations. But there will come a day, perhaps years from now, perhaps long after you have passed through the veil, when they will face their own Gethsemane. They will experience a divorce, a devastating illness, a crushing loss, or a spiritual crisis that strips away their secular illusions. In that moment of darkness, their minds will flash back to you. They will remember the quiet, steady peace that lived in your home. They will remember the way you looked when you spoke of the Savior. They will remember that no matter how chaotic the world became, your faith was a rock that could not be shaken. And they will draw strength from your memory to find their own way back to the Father. You are writing the history that will steady them a century from now. Just as we look back to the journals of early pioneers to find the courage to face our modern trials, your descendants will look back to the story of your life. They will ask, how did my grandmother survive the loneliness of her later years? How did my grandfather maintain his faith when his own family was fractured? How did they stand so firm in a world that was losing its moral mind? The answers they find in the record of your life will be their sword and their shield. Do not rob them of that legacy by retiring from your discipleship now. This brings us to a beautiful, solemn realization. You are not the last of something. You are the witness for something the younger generation cannot yet see. There is a common temptation for older members to look at the current state of the world and the church and feel a sense of decline, to think that the golden age of faith has passed, and that they are merely guarding the ruins of a once great civilization. But this is a profound misunderstanding of the trajectory of the restoration. The stone cut out of the mountain without hands is still rolling forth. The work is not winding down. It is winding up. The challenges facing the rising generation are indeed unprecedented. But so is the spiritual power that is being poured out upon them. They are preparing for a world and a future that will require a level of faith and endurance that has never been demanded of any previous generation. They will face storms of deception, social pressure, and spiritual darkness that make the physical persecutions of Missouri and Nauvoo look mild by comparison. They cannot survive those storms on cheap, borrowed light. They cannot survive on a faith that is merely intellectual, emotional, or social. They need a faith that is deeply rooted in the reality of the living Christ. And they cannot see that reality clearly unless you show it to them. You are the proof that the promise works. You are the witness that the Lord does indeed walk with his people through the fire. You are the evidence that the Holy Ghost is not a transient emotion, but a constant, life-giving companion. When they look at you, they should see what they can become if they stay the course. They should see that old age is not a gray, fading twilight, but a bright, golden afternoon filled with the warmth of a life well spent in the service of God. This requires you to cultivate a spirit of profound hope and joy. If you are constantly anxious, if you are always complaining about the state of the world or the changes in the church, you are sending a dangerous signal to the youth. You are telling them that God is losing, that the adversary is stronger than the covenant, and that there is no real hope for the future. But if you carry yourself with a quiet, holy optimism, if your face is bright, your words are full of gratitude, and your heart is open to the new ways the Lord is leading His kingdom, you are teaching them that the victory of Christ is certain. You are giving them the courage to stand in their own place and fight their own battles. The prophet Joseph Smith, even in his darkest moments in Liberty Jail or Nauvoo, never lost this cosmic perspective. He did not look at the driven, suffering saints and see a dying remnant. He looked at them and saw the seed of a glorious, eternal kingdom. He wrote from the damp floor of his prison cell, "Shall we not go on in so great a cause? Go forward and not backward. Courage, brethren, and on to the victory." Those are not the words of a man who was defeated by his circumstances or discouraged by the weakness of his people. Those are the words of a prophet who saw the end from the beginning and knew that the covenant would ultimately prevail. That same prophetic courage must live in you today. As the oldest person in the room, you are the link between the prophets of the past and the generations of the future. You may have personally known leaders who knew Joseph F. Smith, or David O. McKay, or Harold B. Lee. You carry in your own memory a living connection to the history of this dispensation. You must not let that connection break. You must hold it high like a torch so that those who come after you can see the path clearly. This means you must continue to seek personal revelation for your own life. Do not assume that because you have been a member of the church for 60 years, you have learned everything the Lord has to teach you. The heavens are still open, and the restoration is still unfolding. The Lord has specific, personal instructions for you today, for how to use your time, how to pray for your family, how to serve your neighbors, and how to prepare your own soul for the day when you will stand before Him. Your daily prayers should not be mere repetitions of the past, but active, urgent inquiries. Lord, what wouldst Thou have me do today? Who needs my help? Whose hands are hanging down? Whose knees are feeble that I might strengthen them? When you pray with that kind of focus, your life will never feel small or useless. You will find that the Lord will put people in your path who desperately need exactly what you have to offer. He will send you the lonely young single adult who needs a grandfather's steady advice. He will send you the young mother who needs a grandmother's gentle reassurance. He will send you the bishop who is overwhelmed by the burdens of his office and simply needs an older brother to sit with him, to pray with him, and to tell him that he is doing a good work. Your presence in the congregation is a quiet, powerful sermon that is preached every single week. When you struggle to walk up the steps of the chapel, when you sit through meetings with physical discomfort, when you lift your voice to sing the hymns of Zion even when your breath is short, you are teaching a masterclass in covenant faithfulness. The young people in that room are watching you. They may not say anything, they may not even fully realize it themselves, but they are taking notes on how you live, how you endure, and how you love. They are learning how to grow old without growing bitter. They are learning how to face mortality with hope rather than fear. So, the next time you walk into your chapel and realize that you are the oldest person in the room, do not let your heart sink. Do not look for a quiet corner where you can disappear. Instead, lift up your head and recognize the sacredness of the moment. You are standing where the ancient patriarchs and matriarchs stood. You are the living representative of the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in that room. You are the anchor that holds that congregation to its history and its future. Stand in your office. Inhabit your calling. Speak your witness with the quiet authority of a lifetime of experience. Love the young with a generous, non-judgmental heart that reflects the infinite mercy of the Savior. Show them by the way you live that the path of the covenant is a path of light that grows brighter and brighter until the perfect day. We invite you to leave a simple, brief witness of your faith in the comments below, not as a boast, but as a quiet testimony to the rising generation of the Lord's goodness in your life. Share one line of gratitude for His mercy, or a simple word of encouragement for those who are still early on the path. Let us build a record of steady faith that will stand as a monument for those who come after us.